What's happening, fam? John here from AF Anime. We are back again with another One Piece chapter review, this time for arguably the best chapter since the death of Ace, and that's going to be chapter 1044, which is titled Warrior of Liberation. Now, we have a lot to talk and think about when it comes to the contents of this week's chapter, but as per usual, I'm going to do a recap before I get into the discussion. So if you guys remember the contents of the chapter and you don't need a recap, go ahead and skip forward to this point in the video. But if you're down for the recap, we'll get into it right after we talk about this week's cover page. So the cover page for this week that we're looking at right now is a continuation of the cover storyline, which features the Germa 66 and their emotionless excursion. And it looks like Oven was taking them to his siblings, Charlotte Prim, Charlotte Kato, Charlotte Brownie, and Charlotte Anana, so that way they can operate on the brothers or do some experiments to better understand their technology. And to be honest, as dark as it might seem, I do like the fact that this cover story is finally starting to pick up in pace and actually go somewhere. And if I'm not mistaken, before the Big Mom Pirates had their plans shat on, they were intent on killing off the Germa and then usurping their kingdom and their technology for the sake of gain. So it's nice to see that this cover story shows us that they didn't quite give up on understanding the Germa's technology, but to be honest, I'm just happy that this cover story is finally going in some direction in terms of its narrative. That being said, though, we'll have to wait on developments in this situation, but one thing I do want to talk about when it comes to this cover page is the difference in expression when it comes to Niji and Yonji's faces. Now, if I'm not mistaken, I think that Yonji did have a rather emotional introduction to Nami, and when it comes to Reiju and her emotional understanding, I think it might be possible that each of these siblings, speaking of the Germa kids, might have different levels or different aspects to emotional understanding. Obviously, Sanji would be the one sibling who has his emotions intact, but it would be interesting to see if Oda took a route that showed that each of these siblings have their own way of not being completely emotionless. In any case, that is all I got in regards to the cover story. Now we can go ahead and get on with the recap for this amazing chapter. So the very first page of this chapter kind of bounces around a little bit from Zunisha to Luffy to Momonosuke and Yamato, but in the grand scheme of things, with the inner monologue that we're seeing on this first page that comes from Luffy, we can get a good idea of what the tone of this chapter is going to be. And the last panels on this page are of Momonosuke confirming with Zunisha that Luffy is Joy Boy, and Yamato confirming with Momonosuke that that is in fact what Zunisha said. And as I said, this chapter does bounce around a lot because the next character we check in with is Sanji, who is healing up in the pleasure hall, who apparently has been woken up by the voice of Luffy. And then immediately after we see Sanji's reaction, we see Kid's reaction, Law's reaction, Hyogoro's reaction, Marco's reaction, as well as Nami and Otama. And at first I was thinking to myself, like, do all these characters have the voice of all things? But then I remembered that a handful of chapters ago, Luffy exhibited the ability to kind of mentally reach out to people. And we know he did this with some of the Heart Pirates, so I don't think it has to do with the voice of all things unless it's like some specific talent of his that is kind of the ability to, send out the voice of all things. More on that another time though, because the very next page goes to Sacred Marijoa or Marijoa, or however you want to enunciate it. But we get some very important dialogue coming from the Gorosei, and it's not really super important. They're not up to anything in particular in this chapter. They're really just here for a bit of exposition, but the exposition they do offer is just mind-blowing. So if you're familiar with my reviews, I don't typically address the dialogue unless it has important information, but for this case in particular, I feel like I need to read the dialogue of the Gorosei because it's so loaded with information. And their conversation begins with, "So we lost an elite agent and made Kaido angry. What was the point? What if I told you that there was a potential future that would make us beg for this outcome? It is always better to eliminate dangerous variables. In every era, the world government has attempted to recover the Gum Gum fruit, and not once has it ever succeeded for 800 years. It is as though the devil fruit is trying to escape our grasp, and it very well might be. Zoan fruits contain a will of their own, and this particular fruit has the name of a god. The other name for the Gum Gum fruit is the Zoan type human fruit mythical type model Nika, possessing a body with the properties of rubber and fighting in whatever way he fancies, bringing smiles to the faces of people. The Warrior of Liberation, also known as Nika, the sun god. Awakening brings his rubbery body greater physical strength and freedom. It is said that in all of the world, there is no power more ridiculous." And that line about there being no power more ridiculous is incredibly fitting for the content we're going to cover toward the end of this recap. I mean, it's even punctuated with Conqueror's Haki behind the quote itself. But before we get into that, we need to go and check in with Hiyori and Orochi. Now, they're still in the treasure repository on the second floor, and Orochi is still pinned under the debris that has the sea stone nails in them. And he starts off his dialogue in this chapter by prostrating himself and trying to insist that he had admiration for Oden and more or less was a, lackey to Kaido. But Hiyori's not buying into any of his bullshit and instead takes this opportunity to more or less lecture him and tell him off. And throughout the next 4.5 pages or so, as Orochi's forced to listen, Hiyori recounts the last days of Oden and her time with him, and we get some touching flashbacks and a lot of good moments that have to do with her interactions with Oden as he fulfilled his end of the bargain for Orochi and was supposed to play the fool so that way Orochi would liberate the people in the end. And as we all know, he never did. And after a touching flashback of a moment between young Hiyori and her father, we get this amazing panel right here of Hiyori telling off Orochi in a way that only a princess could. And as she continues to berate and belittle Orochi, we actually get the last will and spirit of Kanjuro in the form of his apparition showing up to the treasure repository. And the apparition proceeds to tell Orochi that he's pretty much spent and done for. And Orochi takes a last-ditch effort to try to get the will of Kanjuro to burn down Hiyori, but instead it actually lights Orochi on fire. And in this moment, it's not really clear if the spirit of Orochi lit him on fire intentionally or if it just happened to fall on Orochi. We will assume the latter for now, but this scene poetically ends with Hiyori saying the dawn is sure to come, and the Kozuki family always keeps their promises. And that's a very fitting transition as we see in the next panel that Luffy is in front of the moon looking like the sun god Nika, and he reveals that this is his Gear 5, or as he says in this chapter, the pinnacle of his power. And after that, we are treated to another amazing panel of Kaido in his dragon form and the Conqueror's Haki from Luffy's Gear 5th just seeping down from the ceiling. And as some of the beast pirates are getting knocked out, Kaido tries to ascertain where this Conqueror's Haki is coming from, and then we are treated to yet another amazing panel in the form of this one right here. Gear 5 Luffy sends a humongous arm down to snatch up Kaido and bring him back up to the fight on the roof, and we get to see the reactions of Law, Kid, and Chopper. And after getting dragged back up to the rooftop by Luffy, we get the confirmation that this is truly the most ridiculous power ever, as we are treated to a handful of panels that shows Luffy just kind of yanking Kaido around and slamming him around in a very cartoonish fashion. And this goofy scene culminates with Luffy falling on his butt and cracking up as Kaido has the typical stars floating around his head and the multiple lumps from being slammed. And after this, Kaido manages to turn the tone of the chapter back to a quick bout of seriousness when he thanks Luffy for surviving and then tries to obliterate him with a blast breath. And the seriousness of this attack is undercut again by Luffy, whose eyes pop out of his head in shock at seeing the blast breath coming in his direction. And then we see what I presume to be a form of awakening where he lifts up the ground and it becomes rubbery, firing back the blast breath at Kaido. And as that explosion goes off, we are treated to this amazing panel of the full reveal of Luffy's Gear 5 form. And after that, we conclude this chapter with two panels, one of Kaido apologizing for the interference earlier and one of the face reveal of Gear 5 Luffy saying, "Don't sweat it, let's finish this up." And wow, just an amazing chapter, well worth the 2-week wait. And like many people have said, I can totally understand why people view this as being the chapter of the decade. So with that, we can now get into the rating and discussion, and yet again I'm giving this chapter a 10 out of 10. And at first I was a little bit annoyed with the pacing and that was going to keep me from giving it a 10, but as I was rereading this to do this recap and review, I noticed that the scene with Hiyori that almost seemed to go on a little bit too long actually served as a perfect transition into the reveal of Joy Boy proactively acting in Wano. And while we're on that point, I guess I can go ahead and start off my discussion with Hiyori. I just felt like her scenes in this chapter were absolutely amazing. Her dialogue was amazing. It was incredibly well done. And like I said, at first it seemed out of place, but in hindsight, it actually looks pretty amazing in context of what's going on in this chapter. Now, I hope that this isn't going to continue to be broken up. If Orochi's going to die by burning to death, I'm fine with that. But ultimately, Hiyori did tell Zoro that she wanted to get the killing blow on Orochi, and her anger throughout this chapter might imply that she could do that, and I hope she does, but I'm just interested to see how this plays out. I don't really see it ending in a way that Orochi would survive, but then again, this is One Piece, so you never know. And I guess the next point of discussion that's worth talking about is the situation between Zunisha, Momonosuke, and Yamato. And I'm sure that Yamato and Momonosuke are still going to do their best to remove any danger from the situation in regards to the explosion or Onigashima falling on the Flower Capital. But at this point, I think that the three of these characters are just going to serve as a bit of exposition and maybe even some historical information in regards to Oden's journal and the past, at least when it comes to Joy Boy and his interaction with Zunisha. And with that being said, I think one thing that we can all look forward to is the eventual conversation that Luffy may have with Zunisha should they both survive and meet up toward the end of Wano's arc. And another point of discussion about this chapter would be the constant theme of drums operating in the background of these scenes. Now, it's just kind of written out in a form of alliteration when we're reading the chapter, but I really just can't wait to see this animated and hear this animated. I mean, I know I say that a lot because I'm just kind of holding off on watching Wano until everything's been completed, but I know that this chapter, when it's translated, is just going to be incredibly beautiful and really thoughtful when you combine all these scenes between the world government, Hiyori, Luffy, Kaido, and all of the characters who are just witnessing all this amazing stuff happen. And speaking of those witnesses, as I said in the recap, I thought it was kind of weird that Sanji, Hyogoro, Marco, and everyone else could hear Luffy up there, but I feel like the drums of liberation and the ability for Joy Boy to put his voice out there for everyone to hear, it's going to be something that's incredibly important and probably even more profound than having the voice of all things. So it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out, and in the future as Luffy looks to inspire people or maybe to rile people up in terms of, you know, being free or getting free from oppression, this could be a very important narrative tool that Oda uses as the world government becomes a major villain to our Straw Hats and the protagonist. Now, my next discussion point is going to be the Gorosei and the important dialogue that we got in this chapter. Obviously, it doesn't seem like they plan on making any moves at the moment, or at least they haven't planned to do so in this chapter. So we can't be 100% certain. They do know that the CP0 member who interfered is likely dead, or at the very least lost, but it doesn't seem that they seem to be aware that Luffy has awakened. And on top of that, we didn't get any reaction from the remaining CP0 member who was still standing. Now, as I said in my previous chapter review, I do think it's unlikely that this last CP0 member will get his hands dirty and proactively involve himself in a fight with the Straw Hats or anyone else. I think he's kind of just going to be there as a mouthpiece or an earpiece for the world government to understand and know what's going on. And with that being said, I'm very curious to see what their next move is going to be. If their ships are blocked out of Wano because of Zunisha, and they don't have any admirals or anyone with any real strength present on Wano aside from that last CP0 member. So I think it's fair to assume that CP0 and the world government are done involving themselves with the events of Wano. And I think the next time we see the Gorosei will be at the end of Wano, once everything is concluded and they get a report or an update about Luffy and his awakening. And when that happens, I think that we will get the eventual push of the conflict between Luffy, the Straw Hats, and the WG, as well as the reintroduction of Eam, who has to learn about these events. So I guess that's just more we can look forward to in terms of another brewing conflict when Wano eventually does taper down and come to an end. But my last point of discussion obviously is going to be the reveal of Gear 5 Luffy. I mean, there's just so much to unpack in terms of what goes down in this chapter, but I gotta say that I absolutely love what Oda decided to do in terms of Luffy and his Gear 5 reveal. Now, in terms of the power we got to see on display, he obviously has gotten a lot stronger, but I think we also get the reveal of his awakened powers in terms of him manipulating the environment around him to turn into rubber, but it also might be something a little bit deeper than that. It's possible that whatever the goofy things that he decides to do or his imagination allows him to do could be dragging other people or other characters into his reality. Like specifically this panel right here where we see Kaido having the stars around his head and the lumps. That obviously is a very cartoony depiction of what's going down, but I'm curious as to whether or not this is just an artistic expression from Oda, or if this is something that characters are forced to deal with when they're battling Gear 5 Luffy. Now, for me at least, when I see the way that Gear 5 Luffy acts when he's in the process of fighting, it gives me serious vibes from a very old movie that I love, and it is the Jim Carrey depiction of The Mask. Now, the Mask is a zany and goofy character, and he does a lot of zany and goofy things, including warping reality for the sake of comedy and for the sake of practical use. And I feel like Gear 5 Luffy is almost a near perfect depiction of how that character acts in that movie. And it's my understanding that that character in that movie is based on the god Loki, who is considered by many to be a very playful god. And I'll admit, the few times that I came across episodes of One Piece before I was an active reader or an active watcher of the series, it came across as zany and goofy, especially in Thriller Bark, and that was something that was kind of a turnoff for me. But eventually, the deep lore behind the characters and the arcs and the events dragged me in. But now that I've seen this chapter, I can totally appreciate and understand why things get zany and goofy from time to time, because that's just part of the formula that makes One Piece so great. In any case, guys, it's getting late, and that's going to do it for my review for this chapter. Just an amazing chapter, and I can't wait to see how the community talks about it. And thankfully, we don't even have a break this upcoming week, so we'll be right back at it. But let me know in the comment section down below what your favorite part of the chapter was. Just everything about this chapter was amazing for me. I love the artwork, I love the story, I love the hype. All of these things were 10s and above. So I'm excited to get the next chapter. Thank you guys very much for tuning in. My name is John from AF Anime. Please like, share, and subscribe if you want to see more One Piece content like this, or comment down below if there's anything you want me to talk about in particular. I will be back very soon with another One Piece related video, but thank you guys again for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one.